The winter of 850 was more than cold weather and short days. It became a proving ground for everything the previous decades had strained: courage, patience, loyalty, and the ability of ordinary people to keep living when the world around them had been reorganized by war. It tested character not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long, grinding stretch of hunger, frozen roads, and failing stores. It tested the community because no household could endure alone. It tested humanity because the easiest way to survive was to narrow your sympathy to your own side. Yet the winter punished anyone who tried to make survival purely tribal. It asked a blunt question of everyone who lived on that island. When the land turns hard and the sky offers no mercy, can people who once fought each other still find a way to survive together? In many places, the answer was yes. In some places, that cooperation was simple and immediate. A settlement with a larger storehouse agreed to share grain in exchange for labor repairing roofs or clearing roads after heavy snow. A group of men from one side helped drag a stuck cart through an icy ford because leaving it meant losing the goods inside. When sickness spread, a healer's knowledge mattered more than a person's origin, and families who would never have eaten together before found themselves waiting in the same doorway for the same remedies. Even small acts, sharing firewood, lending tools, guiding travelers around frozen marshland, created new habits. Habits become expectations, and expectations quietly reshape what people believe is possible. Later, those winter habits echoed into spring. The same neighbors who had shared food now found it harder to return to pure hostility without hurting themselves. If you had survived because another household helped you, it became more difficult to pretend that household was nothing but an enemy. People still argued, still distrusted, still remembered the blood behind them, but they now carried a second memory as well. The memory of surviving together when the land tried to kill everyone equally. English villages and Viking settlements discovered that winter does not care who arrived first, who claims the fields, or which language is spoken around the fire. A storm collapses the roof of a Christian farmer and a Norse settler with the same indifference. A sick child shivers the same way in either household. When stores ran low, when livestock weakened, when travel became dangerous, the difference between enemy and neighbor was forced into the open. Some communities resisted this truth at first. Old wounds and old fear do not fade quickly. But the winter brought situations where refusing help meant losing people you could not replace. It became harder to pretend that the other side was something less than human when you watched them struggle through the same darkness. That shared hardship changed how both peoples viewed each other. The English, who had learned to think of the Vikings as an approaching threat, ships, axes, fire, began to see something they had ignored for years: families. They saw men carrying children through snow. They saw parents arguing over the last of a grain sack. They saw women making the same desperate calculations about food and warmth that English women made. They saw that Vikings had hopes, plans, and fears that extended beyond fighting. The English did not suddenly forget the raids or forgive what had been done, but many began to understand that the Vikings wanted what every community wants when winter bites: to endure, to keep their children alive, to reach spring. The Vikings reached similar realizations about the English. It is easy to dismiss an enemy when you only meet him in battle, or when your only contact is taking what he owns. It becomes more difficult when you must share a road, trade for tools, negotiate shelter, or depend on local knowledge to survive a season that kills the careless. Viking settlers saw English families, not just subjects or victims. They saw children who still played even when adults were afraid. They saw elders who remembered better years and tried to hold households together. They saw English people who wanted to live, who wanted to survive, and who were not so different from themselves when the question was simple: will we make it through the winter? As these realizations spread, the old distance between the two peoples began to collapse. Distance is not only measured in miles. It is measured in how much you can ignore each other, how little you must understand each other, how easily you can imagine that your enemies are made of something different than you. Winter erased that comfortable ignorance. The distance between kingdoms began to shrink as well. Because borders matter less when roads are blocked, food is scarce, and decisions are made locally. The distance between cultures narrowed in daily life, even if the symbols of difference remained. People found themselves connected through the same needs, the same practical problems, and the same small bargains that keep communities from breaking. By the time the worst weeks had passed, something fundamental had shifted. The winter had brought people into contact in ways that summer war rarely does. It did not make them brothers overnight, and it did not dissolve every grievance. But it created a truth that could not be unseen. Coexistence was possible and sometimes necessary. The winter had united them in the narrow sense that it forced cooperation, and cooperation began to create integration. The change was not a clean moment of reconciliation. It was a slow recognition that the future would be built on shared ground, not on endless division. After that winter, everything felt different because the assumptions people had relied on were no longer stable. The English and the Vikings were no longer only enemies defined by raids and retaliation. In many places they had become neighbors, sometimes tense, sometimes wary, but close enough to be real. In some districts that closeness even turned into friendship, not the sentimental kind, but the kind that grows from repeated dealings without betrayal. In mixed communities, families formed across lines that had once been impossible to cross. Family began to mean something wider than blood or language in certain towns and borderlands. The separation that had once seemed permanent started to close, and the sharp division of earlier years began to blur. Trade flourished after the winter, and it did so for a reason that had nothing to do with idealism. Trade is what happens when people recognize that stability is profitable and chaos is expensive. English merchants and Viking merchants started working together more openly. They established routes that were safer because both sides had reasons to protect them. They built relationships that relied on reputation and repeated exchange rather than constant threat. These connections tightened over time until the two economies began to depend on one another. That interdependence created leverage. Breaking the peace meant breaking incomes, food supplies, and access to goods. Trade stopped being only commerce and became one of the strongest incentives for cooperation. It became a practical form of unity, quiet, persistent, and difficult to undo. As trade expanded, cultural exchange accelerated. People learned from those they must deal with. English communities adopted Viking customs where those customs worked. In law, in settlement practice, in certain forms of contract and compensation. Vikings adopted English customs where local knowledge mattered. Farming patterns, land management, and the everyday habits that make a place livable. Language moved across mouths in markets and in mixed households. Some English learned enough Norse to bargain without a middleman. Some Vikings learned enough English to manage trade and land without constant interpreters. Marriages formed between English and Viking families, especially where peace held long enough for trust to become possible. Mixed communities appeared, then mixed families, and the blend became visible in names, crafts, and the way children spoke. This blending did not mean that culture became identical overnight. It meant something more realistic, a gradual integration where difference remained but separation weakened. The two cultures began to overlap in daily practice. The border between English and Viking stayed important in politics and memory, yet in many places it stopped controlling every interaction. People adjusted because they had to. When you share markets and roads, you begin to share habits. When you share winters, you begin to share a future. Political cooperation grew alongside these social changes. The English king and Viking leaders began to work together in limited but meaningful ways. Coordination was not always friendly. It was often cautious and transactional. But it happened. They began establishing joint policies where shared interests were obvious, keeping trade routes open, reducing local violence that threatened both sides, and clarifying rules in border regions to prevent constant retaliation. In some areas, they moved toward unified laws, not perfectly unified, but coordinated enough that people could predict consequences. Governance started to look less like two separate systems colliding and more like two systems learning to coexist and, in places, merge. By 855, integration was well underway. The distance that once felt absolute had shrunk dramatically. Separation was no longer the default in many parts of the former frontier. Division still existed, but it had become a political and administrative question more than a complete social barrier. The English and Vikings were increasingly intertwined. They were still distinct peoples in origin, yet in practice they were living in the same society, relying on the same roads, trading in the same markets, sometimes answering to shared authority. The people of the former Danelaw were no longer only Vikings in the way outsiders imagined. Many were becoming part of English life. They adopted English customs where those customs helped them operate in the surrounding world. They learned English words and, in some cases, the language itself, because it made trade, law, and marriage easier. They became participants in English society even while retaining Norse traditions. Becoming English did not mean erasing identity. It meant adapting to the land they lived on and the neighbors they lived beside. Over time, more people in these regions identified with the place itself rather than with a distant origin. At the same time, the people of England were no longer only English in the old sense. They were absorbing Viking influence. They adopted Norse customs that fit local needs. They learned Norse terms that became normal in daily speech. They incorporated Viking legal ideas and social practices where those practices proved useful. In that sense, English people were also becoming Viking, not by abandoning their roots, but by integrating elements of the culture that had settled among them. The exchange ran both ways, and that is what made it transformative. After the winter of 850, nothing felt distant anymore because the idea of separate worlds had become harder to sustain. The distance between the English and Vikings had faded in daily life. The distance between kingdoms narrowed as governance overlapped in border areas and shared policy became possible. The distance between cultures diminished as language, marriage, trade, and law blended. People who once imagined the other as a foreign force learned to deal with them as neighbors with names, families, and routines. The lesson of these years was clear. The winter did not merely bring cold, it brought a forced cooperation that changed the trajectory of England. It united communities in practical ways and transformed how people imagined the future. It did not erase all conflict, but it proved that survival could depend on working together, and that working together could gradually become normal. What emerged from this period was a new understanding of what England was becoming. The future would not resemble the old world where Vikings were simply invaders and English were simply defenders. The relationship had evolved into something more complex and more lasting. The English and Vikings were no longer strictly separate. They were integrated in economics, intertwined in culture, and increasingly connected in governance. The shape of one people began to appear, not as a claim that everyone suddenly became identical, but as recognition that their lives were now linked and their identities increasingly shared. This integration was not complete and it was not perfect. It did not happen without conflict. Local feuds still flared, old resentments still surfaced. Some communities resisted change longer than others. Some Viking groups remained fiercely separate, and some English leaders refused cooperation whenever they could. Yet the overall direction was unmistakable. Integration was happening, accelerating in the places where peace lasted. It was transforming England, changing the English people, and changing the Viking settlers who had made the island their home. It was creating something new, a blended society with its own character, neither purely English nor purely Norse. By 860, the transformation was well underway and increasingly visible. The English and Vikings were becoming one people in the practical sense that their lives and futures were interwoven. The two kingdoms were moving toward a shared political reality, even if a single unified crown did not instantly erase all local authority. The two cultures were blending into one cultural landscape with mixed customs, mixed speech, and mixed households. Distance had disappeared, separation had weakened, and the old division was closing. The English Church played a significant role in these years, particularly in how it interacted with the former Danelaw. The Church established relationships with Viking leaders because religious institutions were among the few networks that could span borders reliably. Clergy negotiated, mediated disputes, and attempted to extend Christian influence into Viking-held areas. The Church wanted peaceful coexistence, partly because peace protected communities, and partly because peace allowed conversion and integration into broader Christian Europe. The Church's hope was not only spiritual, it was political and cultural. A more unified Christian kingdom that could fit into the larger European order. Some Vikings were interested in conversion, some were curious about Christianity, and some were willing to adopt Christian practices for practical reasons: marriage ties, political legitimacy, trade advantages, or a desire to reduce friction with English neighbors. For these individuals, conversion offered a path into existing institutions and relationships. As conversion began, so did a broader integration into Christian society, at least in outward form. Peaceful relationships between clergy and certain Viking leaders became possible, and those relationships helped stabilize mixed communities. But not all Vikings welcomed conversion. Many remained pagan or committed to traditional beliefs and ways of life. Some viewed Christian influence as a threat to their identity and authority. The tension between Christian and pagan did not vanish, and in some places it continued as a source of conflict. Yet even where religious division remained, the day-to-day reality often pushed people toward coexistence, because constant religious war would have destroyed the stability both sides increasingly depended on. Economic integration continued as trade networks deepened. English merchants sold goods in Viking settlements. Viking goods appeared in English towns. Routes developed that connected communities across former conflict lines. As these connections grew, mutual interests formed. The two peoples gained reasons to maintain peace: a stable market, a predictable harvest, safer roads, and fewer raids that could disrupt everything. Economic interdependence became a quiet but powerful force, shaping policy and behavior. Meanwhile, Vikings in their settlements developed their own laws and customs in ways that reflected their shift from raiders to rulers. They created governance structures, legal systems, and social hierarchies suited to permanent communities. They established themselves as a political authority that expected to endure. Over time, this authority appeared less like an invading camp and more like legitimate rule in the eyes of those who lived under it, especially when it provided predictable law and protected trade. The English, for their part, gradually accepted the reality of Viking settlement. Acceptance did not mean approval. It meant recognizing that the Vikings were not going away and that policies had to reflect that fact. English leaders established new laws and relationships for dealing with Viking neighbors. They learned how to coexist, sometimes through formal agreements, sometimes through local arrangements. The English were adapting to a new reality because refusing to adapt meant endless exhaustion. So when people said, after the winter of 850, nothing felt distant anymore, they were describing more than geography. They were describing a change in how the island felt. The English and Vikings no longer existed in separate worlds. Their economies touched, their cultures overlapped. Their politics in many areas had to coordinate. Their lives were too close for distance to protect them from each other, and too intertwined for separation to remain absolute. The story of the Viking presence in England in this telling is not simply a story of conquest and defeat. It is a story of integration and transformation. It is about two peoples moving, slowly and unevenly, toward a shared society. It is about the disappearance of distance, between neighbors, between cultures, between systems of rule. It is about how division can close not through sudden agreement, but through the repeated pressure of survival, trade, marriage, law, and time. The transformation continued beyond 850 and 855. Integration kept deepening in places where stability held. The two peoples continued to become one in the practical sense that matters most: shared futures, shared markets, shared roads, shared children. The kingdoms continued to move toward a single political reality shaped by cooperation and compromise. The cultures continued to blend into one landscape that could not be neatly separated. Unity emerged not as perfection, but as a workable arrangement that endured. Saying, by 860 the transformation was complete, is a way of marking how far things had gone. The old clear separation was gone. In many areas, English and Viking communities functioned as one society, even if memory and identity remained complex. The distance had disappeared. Separation had ended in daily life. Division had closed enough that it could no longer define the whole island. Integration had become the new normal. After the winter of 850, nothing felt distant anymore because the winter forced two peoples to recognize each other, then taught them to cooperate, and finally left them living in a world where cooperation was no longer an exception. It began in hardship, when survival demanded help. It continued through trade, as mutual benefit created stability. It deepened through cultural exchange, as mixed communities formed. It strengthened through political coordination, as leaders realized that order required cooperation. And it shaped the future through the slow creation of a society that neither side had intended at the start. It all began with that winter, when the cold stripped away illusions, when communities learned that survival could not be built on hatred alone, and when the English and the Vikings, forced close by necessity, stepped into a new reality in which distance disappeared and the island's future had to be shared.